Great. Welcome everybody to Care and the Future of Learning series. This is episode 4 with Professor Katherine Hayles, and I'd like Professor Hayles to, if you'd like to just introduce yourself to the audience. Some people may know your work, some people may not, and then we'll get into a conversation about the piece that we did together for the Special Issue Journal.
Well, thank you very much, Mary, for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and your audience. I'm basically a literary scholar, but before I began my career in literature, I was actually training in the sciences. So I come to my field with a mixed background in literature and science, and most of my research and also my teaching has been in the field of literature, science, and technology.
Yeah, because that's, I mean, one of the fantastic, well, there's a couple of fantastic books that I've been engaged with, but particular How We Think and The Unthought, which you can maybe tell us a little bit about in a second. But they're incredibly, they have this literary, scholarly intake in a sense, but they're very informed by scientific argument and knowledge, and it comes together so incredibly well to enable us to think about how we think, or what you now call non-conscious cognition. So could you perhaps just walk us through some of your key ideas around that, because that will help situate our conversation as well.
Sure. So in How We Think, I was interested in how human consciousness in particular has been shaped by our experiences with technology. And the human engagement with technology goes back to the very beginning of the species. We can consider the domestication of fire, for example, a technological achievement. And throughout the ages, technology has shaped how groups interact, but more fundamentally, it has also shaped how the human body, the human nervous system, and consciousness itself has been formed. So that book was really a deep plunge into the idea of technogenesis. That is, that the human and the technology are braided together. They were from the beginning and they continue to be into the present. So kind of central to that idea is the notion of synaptic winnowing, phenomenon that Gerald Edelman has called neural Darwinism. So the idea behind that is that those synaptic connections that get reinforced by the environment strengthen and grow. Those that don't wither and eventually may disappear altogether. So that means at birth, every human child is engineered, so to speak, by his environment to have the kind of neuronal structure that fits that particular context, whether that's 20th century or 21st century urban America like Los Angeles, or whether it's a tribal area in Africa. Those children will be neurologically adapted to whatever their environment is suited for. That's a kind of profound realization about the connection between human thought and the environment. And of course, technology now in the 21st century is a major factor in urban settings, in particular, like the city I live in, Los Angeles, California. So that was the book, How We Think. And in the sequel to that, called Unthought, The Power of the Cognitive Non-Conscious, I turned from consciousness and the implication of consciousness with technology to the non-conscious. And this is a relatively recent experimental discovery in cognitive science, psychology, and so forth, where it has been revealed that a level of neuronal processing exists below consciousness that operates much faster than consciousness does and is able to parse information too dense and complex for consciousness to understand. So this is what I call the non-conscious, the cognitive non-conscious. It's closely tied in with the body and with the immediate environment.
Yeah.
The non-conscious is responsible to create a coherent body image, and it has much less tendency to fabulate than consciousness does. So one of the primary tasks of consciousness is to make the world make sense. And if something bizarre or unusual happens, consciousness simply makes up a story to explain it, even though it may be completely false. The non-conscious is not primarily verbal. It's tied in with all of the sensory systems. It can, to a very limited extent, communicate verbally, but primarily it's not verbal. So it's more directly related to the environment, and it is what first receives sensory information about the environment and also the internal body states. And then consciousness comes on almost a full half second later. So information is processed first by non-conscious cognition, and then consciousness becomes aware of what is happening in non-conscious cognition. And once the global workspace is ignited, as Stanislaw Dehaene says, then one can continue to think about that thought indefinitely. But it's non-conscious that processes that information first, and non-conscious is closest to what's actually happening in the world.
Yes.
I think that a traditional name for non-conscious cognition is intuition. So something that hovers at the edge of consciousness, often precedes consciousness, but there's a growing sense of the importance of something. And that has been now experimentally verified to occur through non-conscious cognition. So I think that non-conscious cognition is deeply tied up with creativity. That it is responsible for those flashes of insight or those moments of intense intuition when we sense something even before we consciously understand what it is.
Yes, and that's the amazing, I think, interest I've had in your work too, is this kind of sensibility around the non-conscious. And in our conversation for the journal, we spoke about that correlation between creativity and, well, the non-conscious and creativity. But I just wanted to pick up the kind of threads there, because it's just that thinking about that moment before and how, in a way, consciousness sort of, you could almost call it, it needs to be a servant to the kind of intuition almost, because in fact it's intuition that really, given what you're saying as well, it's in a sense not been acknowledged perhaps in particularly in the recent maybe scientific revolutions, of its significance in actually establishing our connections to the environments in which we inhabit. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that it orients us. And I think I gave you this example before. I mean, as a filmmaker, because I shoot with a camera, the camera becomes an extension in a way of my own bodily thinking. And it's often reliant on intuition. It doesn't, and it's through that I can actually document or tell stories, as opposed to perhaps that notion of, you know, the thinking mind setting up, well, what you're saying actually is the thinking mind sets up fabulation in a way. And we need storytelling and we need fabulation. But what is fascinating, and what we touched upon a little bit in our conversation, but what's really fascinating to draw out now is that notion of the way in which technology perhaps enables some of that participatory intuitive thinking, and also the ethical realm in which we can inhabit to enable perhaps changes in the ways in which, you know, the ways in which the future is headed, if that makes sense. I mean, the journal's about care and the future of learning, but what we're concerned with kind of that technological lens of non-cognitive thought, if that all makes sense.
Yes, well, I don't mean to downplay the importance of consciousness. It's just that we've had a couple of millennia now patting ourselves on the back because we're conscious creatures and thinking that Homo sapiens are superior to every other life form because we know that we're conscious and so forth. But what we have in common with many other life forms basically is cognition. And much of that cognition is non-conscious. So it's a way of taking a more accurate measure of how Homo sapiens fit into the general picture of biota on Earth and assigning a more realistic and perhaps a humbler place among all of the cognitive creatures on the planet.
Yes, I think that's what I find very intriguing about your work and about this idea also of the non-conscious, is that it's putting us within a system of worldly kind of inhabitants, and that in that sense, cells in our body have a cognitive intelligence that doesn't maybe speak in a language, but has its own language, and how you understand that kind of relationship becomes, I think, central to the future and to the care of the future in that sense too, because it opens up our horizons about our own bodies, say, for instance, as they participate in the world, but also the world and how it in some ways sees us or participates with us. I mean, I just find that just so rich in terms of, moving forward.
Yeah, and also it opens up the whole question of meaning. And traditionally, of course, humans have thought of meaning as a verbal construction. And because we're the only species that has language, there's been a tendency to think that only humans can create meaning. But if we take a biosemiotic approach, meaning is a way of interpreting information from the environment. And if we think about meaning in those terms, then every life form has the capability to engage in meaning-making practices, including
Yes.
bacteria, including plants, including organisms without brains or neurons.
Yeah.
And that too, I think, is a really healthy corrective to our traditional focus on human-generated meanings.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm hoping that more and more that enables us to make kind of changes really to how we deal with ourselves and with each other, but with the planet more generally. Did you? I think we've come to the sort of end of this short episode. Did you want to say anything more, reflect on any other point before we finish up?
Well, I think that this also has a lot of implications for the future of learning. And I understand the focus of the issue is the future of learning. And it suggests that learning should be much more multifaceted than
Yes.
just a focus on consciousness. That would be particularly important for children and young people, but really for everyone at every age, that learning becomes a venture into experiencing the world on multiple levels, not simply what we think about the world.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And the journal, in many ways, some of the pieces in it also have this, I guess, a predisposition towards trying to find other ways of making meaning. And I think, but what's so I think wonderful about your work is that it gives us a handle, I suppose, into thinking through emotionally, physically as well, on how to actually perhaps adapt some of this thinking into the classroom, but also more broadly into aesthetic and cultural work. I mean, I think that's what's so powerful about it. So I'd like to thank you kindly for joining for this episode, and also for being part of the conversation and the issue. It's just been a great privilege for me. So thank you kindly.
Well, it's been a great pleasure for me as well, and thank you for your invitation.